those around her. And there's a whole collection of rituals associated with giving birth and with the immediate aftermath of giving birth that were supposed to ensure that the child grew up to be healthy. For example, there were superstitions surrounding how to handle the umbilical cord. One was that the umbilical cord must never touch the ground, lest the child grow up unable to hold water. If the child was a boy, there was a tradition that you had to make sure that you didn't cut the cord too short, otherwise he may be, to use their words, insufficient in the encounters with Venus. If it was a girl, you wanted to make sure that you didn't cut the cord too long, or she might become, again, to use their words, immodest. And delivery was characterized by all sorts of these sort of gender-infused rituals. Now, following the birth, the mothers would immediately take up the task of breastfeeding her child. Actually, the mother probably wouldn't be the first one to breastfeed her child. Probably a neighboring woman would be the first one. So a woman who had gathered at the house to support the mother, a neighboring woman who was breastfeeding her child would probably breastfeed the new baby first, since her milk would already be in. But across New England, mothers had to breastfeed their children because the only alternative was to hire a wet nurse who could do it for her. And because women across New England are breastfeeding, there's no alternative. Nursing occurred in public as well as in private. Women would sit on the ground outside the church and do it there. Or they might breastfeed at home on their bed. It didn't matter if other people were around. The kid was hungry, the women breastfed, no matter where they were or who was around them. And breastfeeding actually played a really important role in women's lives, and that's because nursing suppresses the period and hence fertility. So that women, as long as they were breastfeeding, most likely wouldn't get pregnant. And so what we see is that women's lives revolved around the personal seasons of pregnancy and lactation. And these were usually 20 to 30 month cycles. And women would usually wean their kid at around 10 to 15 months. And when they wanted to wean the kid, they would actually go on something known as a weaning trip, where the mother would physically leave town for a couple days so that the child could make the transition to solely using solid food. So again, these three stages of the reproductive cycle, pregnancy, birth, lactation, dominate women's lives. And these are constant cycles. Just to give you an idea, Abigail Adams had 6 kids in 7 years. This means that she was pregnant or recovering from pregnancy for almost a decade. And this steady cycle of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and weaning ensured that women were always conscious of their bodies. Colonial women had to calculate their baby's protection and care as they went about their daily lives. So as they're giving birth to baby number 6, they have to make sure that their toddlers aren't falling into the fire. So you're constantly worrying about all of these kids. They had to figure out how, in what ways their daily domestic duties might impact their bodies while they're pregnant. So for example, there's a folk belief that when you're in your final months of pregnancy, you're not supposed to lift your you're not supposed to lift your hands above your head. The reason you're not supposed to do this was there was a belief that if you lifted your hands above your head, that the umbilical cord would get wrapped around the child's neck and basically the fetus could die. So the question then becomes, how do you go about your everyday domestic duties? Weaving, picking apples, making beer, running after your other kids, when at the same time you're fearful to lift your hands above your head. Also, if you're breastfeeding, if you're constantly breastfeeding, you have to figure out how far away can you get from your child. Do you have time to go to the well to fetch water before your infant needs to be breastfed? For mothers, biology did indeed shape their destinies, and this was a constant cycle that would dominate their lives. Now, mothers were the primary parent for all children up until the age of at least 6 or 7. And children required supervision, and since women's work was centered around the home and garden, they were, of course, the closest at hand to watch them. Now, childhood was perceived as a time of irresponsibility. It was seen as an unproductive stage of life. And kids below the age of 6 or 7 were basically deemed too young to assume responsibility. And this belief in their inability to be responsible was reinforced by the clothing that mothers put children in. You see, if you look at this picture here, this is a picture known as Elizabeth Freak and Baby Mary. So obviously this is a little girl. But both boys and girls would have worn very similar outfits. They both wore long gowns with petticoats from the end of infancy until about the age of 7. And so you're going to have lots of little boys. So little boys up to the age of 7 are essentially going to wear outfits just like this one. So they're going to look just like little girls. Now, as the boys... Now, there's several advantages to putting everybody in this outfit. First of all, it's much easier to deal with diapering when you're wearing a dress than if you've got breeches on little kids. Also, as the kid grows, it's easier to hem a dress very quickly than it is to hem breeches. Mothers might make some small changes if this was a little boy. For example, as little boys get older, they probably wouldn't make the little boy wear this head covering that's right here, although the little girls definitely would. But again, by putting little boys in these little dresses, it basically is a reminder of their dependence on and identification with women. Now, once the little boy got to be about 7 or 8, he'd be given his first pair of breeches, and with those pants came the added responsibility to help his father. And help his father in the fields, or if his father was a blacksmith, to help his father with being a blacksmith. Now, girls, once they got to the age of 6 or 7, were also given additional responsibility. They were expected to help with sewing, cooking, and cleaning. Now, we've already said that your average mother has about 7 kids. And if you have 7 kids, it means you can't be a helicopter mom. You just don't have time to dote on every single kid as much as you would want to, because you have a generalized responsibility for an assembly of youngsters. So you can't just concentrate your devotion to a few. And what this meant was that in early New England, mothering was extensive instead of intensive, because she had to look over all 7 of her kids. She couldn't focus and be intensive on just a few. Now, the greatest joy for a woman in New England was to live long enough to see her grandchildren. You see, the concept of motherhood was very closely tied to fertility. To be fruitful and have children, and have those children have children, was seen as a blessing. And fruitfulness conferred status. So the more children you had, and the more children's children you had, that reinforced that you were a good mother, and hence a good wife. And so the crown of motherhood came in old age, when a woman got to see all of those grandbabies running around. So in conclusion, this is an epitaph of Hannah Moody, and here's actually a picture of her tombstone, which is located in Maine. And again, we can see reiterated those traits that we have studied today: prayerfulness, watchfulness, humility, charity, faithfulness. What we see is that throughout New England, on both the towns and the farms, a woman's highest aspiration was to be remembered as a good wife, or more commonly, a goodie. Through her labor as a housewife, she was in charge of manufacturing and the processing of food, or she had to trade to get it. As a deputy husband, she could step into her husband's shoes and represent him in economic matters if need be. As a neighbor, she not only had to be friendly, but she also had to provide charity to those in need. And as a mother, her life would revolve around the cycle of pregnancy, birth, and lactation. But she would be rewarded for this if she got to live long enough to meet her grandbabies. And as a Christian, it was her duty to not only love Christ, but to bring her family to Christ. And we also saw how the role of a good wife not only shaped and modeled the lives of colonial women, but they also shaped the communities in which they lived, and these women were instrumental in the founding of new communities. Well, I hope you all have a really lovely week and you're able to survive snowpocalypse. Next week when we meet, we'll be discussing the readings from this week. But we'll also be discussing the readings on the revolution. And I look forward to seeing you all then, assuming we don't have another snowpocalypse.